So let's get started with today's main speaker, Lisa Williams. I'm going to share my screen, but Lisa, do come on and share your camera. I would tell our attendees more about your wealth of experience, but I think you know it best and you can tell us about that yourself. Lisa's going to chat us through her experience of creating the Black History walking tours in Edinburgh and just further experience from her wider work. So let me just get this up and running. Okay, just let me know whenever you want me to flick through to the next slide, Lisa. Over to you.
Okay, good morning to everyone, and thanks very much for the lovely welcome. So I'm going to talk you through how I created the Black History walking tours of Edinburgh, some of the issues and challenges along the way of delivering it and developing it, and where my hopes are for the future of it. But also I'm going to bring in some ideas of how to create inclusive, best practice really for inclusivity, particularly working with volunteers. So next slide, please. Okay, so I've got a photograph here of, this was a really exciting tour that I did actually with lots of different people that came from all over the globe. So we ended up having some really exciting conversations along the way. So every tour that I do is a little bit different depending on who comes. I get a lot of folks who are born in Edinburgh, they've always lived in Edinburgh, and when they walk around the centre of the city with me, they're starting to see their own city with new eyes, and for them it can be quite an emotional experience. So it's an emotional experience for different people in different ways. And a lot of what I'm doing when I'm taking a group of people around is in a way creating a kind of supportive space for those emotions to come up as we're moving from one story and one part of history and to a different area of the city. So I think the fact that we're moving from one stop to another allows that kind of processing to happen. So we start the tours in the centre of the new town, which, as we know, was the most expensive piece of real estate by the time it was finished at the end of the 18th century. So we start in the new town and we actually work back and we finish at the back of the National Museum of Scotland in the old town. So there's something about the significance of the buildings that we're actually engaging with and starting to bring out some of the stories of the people who maybe created the wealth to allow those buildings to come about in the first place, but also the kind of psychic effect that these buildings were designed to have that particular effect on people as well. And that's not always something that we consider. We look at some of the statues, which of course are now highly contested as of last year, and we talk about some of the stories about the people who are in the statues, but also some of the people who may have been involved with that person on the other end, let's say in the Caribbean or in India or somewhere else in the world. So what I try to do is, again, talk about the story of the person on the statue, but also link it very much to the context of who they were engaging with and who they were colonizing or fighting against somewhere else in the world. So the fact that this is embodied learning makes it a little bit different from being in a setting when you're in one building itself. So the fact that you're moving, the fact that we are engaging very intensely sometimes with specific sites. So let's say there is a graveyard that we stop at, there's a gravestone that we spend some time in talking about a woman who was enslaved in the Caribbean is actually buried in the centre of Edinburgh. And those kinds of sites can create their own atmosphere and their own kind of, they evoke emotions even without the story itself. What it does is give us a chance for dialogue along the way. But what I do at the very beginning is I set up a kind of framework for the tours, the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about for the next 2 hours. And I do warn people that it will be an emotional journey, so to be prepared for that as they go along. I also tried to anticipate some of the questions which sometimes try to derail the stories, if you like. So I tried to make sure that people are quite clear about the difference, for example, between chattel slavery that affected enslaved African people in the Caribbean with, let's say, indentured labourers who were sent from Scotland, sometimes by force, as we know, and had gone through the suffering of the land clearances and so on. But the fact that their experiences were different and they were legally different means that the legacies of those two things are very, very different today. So the reason I explain these things is to bring some clarity to the stories at the very beginning, but also try to create that link between the past and the present, and to show exactly how the past has led to the present today and the kinds of inequalities that we're still living with, both within Scotland and also globally. When we get to the end of the tour, we will leave it on a positive note, and we leave it with a call to action for further dialogue, to take these kinds of stories and these kinds of ideas, a bigger sense of Scotland, a global Scotland, if you like, into their communities, and to be able to continue these talks. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So like I said, I start in the centre of Edinburgh's new town, which was referred to as the Athens of the North by the time it was built at the end of the 18th century. Now, the new town has 320 addresses that actually show up on the slavery compensation list. And this is when former enslavers, not the enslaved, were compensated with for their so-called property on emancipation. So basically, emancipation occurred in most of the British Empire in 1834, but the people who were enslaved on plantations actually had to stay on those plantations for several more years in most of those Caribbean colonies. And it was referred to as the apprenticeship system, where basically you had to stay on a plantation, you're still not getting paid, but it's now called the apprenticeship system rather than slavery. So this was met with a huge amount of resistance, and it was dismantled early. So by 1838, most places had got rid of their apprenticeship system at that particular point. What most people don't know is that how people were compensated in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in the rest of Britain. Scots were actually overrepresented on that list. People in Edinburgh were overrepresented on that list. People in the new town itself were also overrepresented on that list. £20 million was borrowed by the government in order to give those payouts to those enslavers. And there was quite a bit of scandal in 2015 when the Treasury put out a tweet, which they quickly retracted. And basically it meant that most people in Britain realised that taxpayers in Britain were still paying off that loan right until 2015. The other piece that people don't always know is that £27 million was actually due to be paid back by formerly enslaved people themselves as part of that apprenticeship system. So when I'm talking about this at the beginning of the talk, people are often quite shocked. We have people who have turned around to me and said, look, I've lived in Edinburgh my entire life and in any of this, and I'm finding it quite shocking, and it means I have to go back and really reevaluate every single thing that I've ever believed or understood about my city and maybe who I am as a person. So sometimes people will go quite quiet in the middle of the tour, and then they'll actually say that to me, saying, you know, I'm fine and I'm enjoying the tour, but I'm just really having to process all these things that I'm hearing. So we also need to remember the new town was the most expensive piece of real estate. I have the world here, but it was definitely in Europe at that point, and it was the biggest piece of urban planning at that point. But we need to remember, of course, that Scotland was one of the poorest nations in Europe before this point. So we need to think about where those kinds of money flows came from. They came often from India, from the East India Company, and also some of the money starting to come in from slave plantations in the Caribbean. It wasn't all from those areas, but it get a significant amount of the profits to allow that very, very quick development to happen from those areas. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what I do is I show that Scots were very much involved in the transatlantic slave system, not just in the British colonies, but also right across the entire region, including Dutch colonies, Spanish colonies, and Portuguese colonies. So we think often that slavery ended in, let's say, 1838. We don't always know that Scots were involved in the Dutch Caribbean, Dutch colonies, which didn't actually abolish slavery until the 1860s. And then Brazil actually had slavery until 1888. So we're starting to get, close to the 20th century. So next slide, please. So we start here, it's controversial, Melville Monument. It's been a huge site of attention in the last year or so. One of the myths that sometimes people will come up with is to say that we must be very careful about not taking the present lens and placing it on the past. And that is just what people did then, that is just how they thought then. And one of the things that I try to really highlight is that very many people at the time, especially working people, who were very, very against slavery, but they didn't have a voice. There were working class people who were oppressed, often by the very same people who are oppressing people in the colonies as well. A lot of these monuments at the time were extremely unpopular. Working people didn't want them. And even the Melville Monument was part of many years of wrangling about whether this monument should even go up in the first place. Even the rich people that lived around that monument in St Andrew's Square itself. He was referred to as the uncrowned King of Scotland. I won't go into his story at the moment. There's been a huge amount of debate around whether he was a gradual abolitionist or whether he was somebody who was trying to impede the end of the slave trade. So this is not slavery itself, but this is just actually the trafficking of African people across the Atlantic, which was abolished by the British in 1807 eventually. This was several years after Melville had been removed from positions of power. So he actually orchestrated military missions. It's in fact the biggest military mission to have ever left Britain, which a lot of people don't know about, to crush a lot of resistance that was happening against slavery right across the region. And then to actually go and reinstate chattel slavery in a place like Haiti, where the Haitian Revolution had created one of the only, really only fully successful rebellions or wars of resistance, a full war of resistance against slavery, where people were emancipated. And people like Henry Dundas and many Scots who were involved in leading the armies and the navies at that particular time, Army and the Navy, went out to try to reinstate slavery and take the island from them for the British, for example. So to call him an abolitionist, it doesn't make any sense at all. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we talk about the Haitian Revolution. This is Cecil Fataman, who was one of the original ringleaders of the rebellion when it started in 1791. There are very many women involved in resistance. And I think sometimes it's difficult when we're working in heritage organisations here to actually be able to get hold of dignified images of people who were resisting against British colonial rule, and particularly against Scottish people who were, like I said, often part of the military. So it's really important that we try to find as many dignified images as we can in order to kind of combat the psychic effect of having readily available images of people who were really carrying out some of the most despicable acts of violence and genocide, sometimes right across the colonies. So it's very, very important to, let's say, if you're putting together an exhibition, you want to work with communities of colour, you really need to think very carefully about the kind of imagery that you're using. We need to try to move away from only having images of enslaved Africans in passive positions, kneeling with chains on, asking for freedom, when the reality was very often that people were very, very fierce, very skilled, and very strategic resistant fighters. So let's go to the next slide, please. So again, many instances of resistance by Indigenous people as well. People don't always know about the original peoples of the Caribbean. We have an image here of Joseph Chatouet of St. Vincent, who is considered to be a national hero in the small island of St. Vincent, and again killed by a Scotsman, which was often the case. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the Earl of Hoopton. So again, this is just an example of a statue that is in St Andrew's Square. It's just outside Dundas House, which is the bank, Royal Bank of Scotland. And what I try to do is use the kinds of statues that we have, the kinds of locations that we have in Edinburgh, and like I said, start to bring in some of the stories from the other side. So when I did the research on the fourth Earl of Hoopton, one of the areas where he fought was in Grenada, which is where my mum was from, which is where I've lived many years. And I know I've even walked on the areas where he would have fought, trying to put down, again, another war of rebellion, which almost allowed Grenada to become a free republic in the 1790s. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is a mock-up of a person who was one of the main leaders of that particular rebellion. His name was Julien Fedon. He was a mixed-race planter originally, who ended up leading this rebellion, which interestingly was a multiracial rebellion. So it was free white planters that joined, who were French, being oppressed by the British, Scots particularly. And then obviously the bulk of the people who were fighting were enslaved African people. So when I start to talk about some of the people on the other side, it's interesting to have these conversations about what actually makes a hero and try to move away from this idea of hero worship. We need to get away from, when we're talking about Scottish imperial history, and again, when some of it is new to you and it's a little bit shocking and it's hard to come to terms with in some ways, then we need to get away from these ideas of having to have pride or having to have the flip side of that, a sense of shame in maybe what you feel that your ancestors have done. So I think sometimes those kinds of emotions that come up can obstruct a mature conversation that we need to be able to have about the past. Let's go to the next slide, please. The other important thing to point out to people that haven't been to the Caribbean or don't know much about it is that there are very many statues who are commemorating the very same people who were fighting against Scots who were out in the Caribbean. So, for example, we have John Gladstone of Leith, which, if you're from Edinburgh, you know that's part of Edinburgh, who received the greatest payout on that compensation, the equivalent of £83 million in our money today. This is one person, for the estates that he was involved in, stretching all the way from Guyana in South America all the way up to Jamaica, so about 11 estates. And one of the estates that he owned was in Grenada, where again a massive rebellion happened in 1823, and here we have a statue of Kwamina Gladstone. So you can hear it in the name, Kwamina Gladstone, who was one of the main leaders of that rebellion in 1823. And he's the person who was commemorated outside the bank in the capital of Guyana. Let's go to the next slide, please. We have other statues which are creating a lot of controversy as well. So we talk about David Hume as we go past. We talk about his racist footnote, which is basically upholding a sense of a white supremacy, which some people will say it wasn't that important, it was just a footnote, but it was also because he was so influential and so well known, and he used to travel, of course, and he used to network with very many people around the world. And he influenced people like Thomas Jefferson, for example, who writes a book in 1780, which is extremely influenced by David Hume's ideas, and almost a word for word copy of what he said about white people being superior to everyone else in the world. So it's very important. We need to think about the intellectual construction of race. And I think when we're dealing with inequality, when we're dealing with the legacies of race and really getting to understand that, one of the most important things is to understand the social construction of race and where that came from in the first place. A lot of it came from Enlightenment scholars, not necessarily Scottish, it could have been from other areas of Europe. But we need to think about where these ideas of race came from and how they hardened and changed and became a bit more fixed during the height of colonialism in the middle of the 1800s as well. If we think about the Barbados Slave Code, which was something which very specifically said that people of African descent were the people who were going to be legally enslaved, had absolutely no right to life, were considered property, not considered human. And these kinds of ideas have filtered down through the ages. And as we go through the actual tour, I actually do talk about some of the now declassified documents, even during World War II, where people in the government are desperately trying to keep people from ex-colonies from settling in Britain for good, because they're talking about, we don't want the pollution of our British white gene pool and things like that. So it's important to understand how these things were constructed, how they morph over time, and at what point things start to change and why they start to change, and how some of those ideas are still with us today. Let's go to the next slide, please. The other important thing I do is wherever we have the actual words that have been written down or recorded of people of colour, that we bring those words and we speak those words as much as we can into the space where those people spoke them originally. We have Sarah Parker Remond on the left here, we've got Frederick Douglass on the right, both important African-American abolitionists in their own way. Sarah Parker Remond was a woman who was born free, but denied citizenship of her own country due to her colour. And Frederick Douglass, one of the most important abolitionists, who was very much supported by his wife, Anna Murray Douglass, and other women in the family as well. So that's an important thing to do, to remember that there was also this Black intellectual critique against slavery and against colonialism. Let's go to the next slide, please. The other important thing to do, as we know, many heritage organisations do this, many big organisations do this. They invite creative responses to the work and to the history, and to be able to interpret the history in a way that really touches the heart, and it touches people in a way that if you're delivering the information in a more traditional way or a drier way, it doesn't affect people in quite the same way. So we have John Agard here from Guyana, who does a wonderful poem about a man called John Edmonston, who was a formerly enslaved man from Guyana, who actually comes to Edinburgh and teaches Charles Darwin the act of taxidermy. And they think that without his skills, Charles Darwin would not have come up with the theory of evolution in the way that he did. We have the former poet laureate of Jamaica here, Lorna Goodison, who has written some wonderful poems imagining what it would have been like if Robert Burns had gone to Jamaica after all to take up that role in the slave plantation that he was planning to, and what that might have looked like. Let's go to the next slide, please. The other really important thing to do is not to think of Black history as something that's separate from Scottish history. So making sure that we're also highlighting those past examples of solidarity, of multiracial solidarity, particularly among women. Well, we have here on the left some of the women from the Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society, who were very much in solidarity with people like Harriet Tubman, that we see here on the right, who, as many of you will know, was the leader of the Underground Railroad in America, putting her own life at risk to create the conditions for African-American people to move from the South and up to the North, and to be able to self-emancipate and claim their own freedom. So we have these amazing situations and stories of women who actively got other women in Scotland to create clothing, for example, to send out to America, to send money, to send assistance on whatever they could, whatever they were asked for, and clothing so that African-American women could look as if they were free women while they were moving from the south up to the north. And often when I speak to groups of women of all different backgrounds, people are very touched by that. In fact, that kind of solidarity, where these women abolitionists, unlike many other white male abolitionists, were really extending that sense of solidarity with no sense of condescension or even racism that you sometimes come across with some of our most well-known male abolitionists. Let's go to the next slide, please. The other important thing to do is to make sure, if you're not sure about where to find these stories, is to look for perspective and scholarship from other countries. So to get a perspective on how people look at Britain or how people look at Scotland from the outside, as much as you can, read articles, read books from scholars coming from the Caribbean or coming from India or coming from Africa, will have a very, very different slant and perspective on history, which will make it very much easier for you if you're trying to create an exhibition or if you want to have a partnership with communities of colour who probably would be coming with a similar perspective on Britain, having their own lived experiences, intergenerational memories of a very troubled relationship with the British state on lots of different levels. Maybe people's grandparents coming here during the Windrush generation treated very badly. My own grandfather, for example, stowing away as a teenager on a boat in World War II to come and fight for the mother country and being treated very, very badly and being racially discriminated against and refusing to come back and fight for the World War II. Let's go to the next slide, please. So ending the tour is really important. We end with positivity, we end with high notes, we end with stories of power, we end up with stories. For here we have an organisation that was set up in Edinburgh University at the turn of the 20th century, the Afro-West Indian Society, and this is a group for people of Caribbean and African origin who were studying at Edinburgh University and went on to go out into the world and do amazing things for their countries. So I think, yep, that's the end of the tour part, and then I just have a few things to mention on the next few slides. So next one, please. The other important thing to do, especially if you're working with volunteers, is to create pipelines. So for me, when I'm working, I'm always thinking ahead of the next year or the year after that, and thinking about how, even if something's a one-off project, it doesn't end there, that you stay in contact with people, you make sure that they're aware of these possibilities coming up, and you also create a pipeline for capacity later on, which also builds community as well. So one of the projects I'm actually just doing right at the moment, as you can see, it ends at the end of the month, is a project I put together called Masked Words, where we're bringing together traditional carnival masquerade, which is the kinds of the kinds of characters that come out of Caribbean folklore, which is acted out on the street in various costumes, and those costumes are handmade normally. And they often involved an area of performance. So that could be a speech, that could be silent movement, but it could be something that people in the culture very much understand and look forward to year after year. So it's a 1-month course. What I've done is set it up so some of the sessions are online because of COVID, and also for accessibility, and also some of them will be in real life. And we're going to get together and we're going to film some of these performances, bringing together poetry, Edinburgh's Black history, and Caribbean masquerade all together, and then see what those young people make of it, how they bring themselves into these stories and create these performances. All the tutors are of Caribbean heritage. It's going to be filmed for the Edinburgh Festival Carnival, so we'll get a big reach at the end. But I'm trying to make sure that it's connected to other projects to do with performing and to do with film and to do with history. And hopefully some of those young people will get excited about being involved in the tours down the road as well. So next slide, please. So I started my own original experience, my own education when I was 18. I did a course in social psychology and African and Asian studies. And it was a very, very specific course at the time, which no longer exists, where we had a chance to work in a interdisciplinary centre. So we would learn everything from Caribbean history to literature to economics, and so on. So we get a real chance to be able to blend all of these different ideas. But it was very much about critiquing this Eurocentric view of history that most of us will have grown up with in Britain. Several years ago, I took a course with the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights across in Glasgow and the African Motion Film Festival. Put on a great short course called Recovering Scotland's Black History. And this is something obviously people have been looking into for decades, hasn't always been credited. That's a very important thing to do, to make sure that you credit people who've done the work before, so it doesn't look like you're just coming in pretending that you've stumbled across this information that other people have, as long as you know of that scholarship. So also, make sure that you try to find out if other people have done this work beforehand. So a lot of it is from my own research as well. I've got a great deal of help from different scholars, Scottish scholars and Caribbean scholars, which has been wonderful. I did lots of test runs. I took out friends as guinea pigs and to sort of see what would be interesting and different locations we could stop at. And it's evolving as we continue. So I started for Black History Month, but then I continued it through the year as well. So doing private tours, particularly for school groups, which is very exciting, working with teachers and working with pupils, which is very rewarding. You get some really good questions from the young people. Let's go to the next slide, please. And a few challenges along the way, but not as many as you might think, actually. More joy than anything else. I have a great passion for what I do, and I get a really good response from people, and we learn together as we go along. I didn't have any funding in the beginning, so I did it totally off my own back. I think my kids were a bit neglected for a while. I spent a lot of time delving into that research and then getting it out on the street. And one of the important things, I was very, very honoured to receive an honorary fellowship from Edinburgh University a couple of years ago for the research I've done in this area. But it wasn't just for the research, it's about taking this information and getting it out onto the street and making sure that we have this kind of two-way conversation with people out there, and you're not hiding up this knowledge and information in the archives or in a university. Sometimes there's challenges on the content because there's an awful lot to say, and it will change depending on people's particular interests as well. Sometimes you've got to be careful about how you deliver this sensitive material. So sometimes you've got to warn people about the kinds of things you're going to say, or make sure engage people's emotions and expressions, so you're not going too far. Because to be able to tell the truth about this story, you do have to talk about some quite upsetting things, and sometimes you've got to know where that limit should be at that point, because you never really know what that might trigger in people who are on the group. So like I said, working with schools and youth groups is very, very rewarding. Working with all kinds of young people who are not afraid to ask questions, and they're really good at making links between the past and the present. And I get some wonderful messages from young Black people all around the world. Like, sometimes I just wake up to a really unexpected message on Instagram from a young Black curator just starting out in museums in Canada, just saying, I've been really inspired by your work, and now I want to go into heritage. So I think it's really important that we do show examples and show role models and show different ways that we can approach heritage. So next slide, please. I'm just coming to the end. Different ways to be fully inclusive, and we can talk about this when we get to the Q&A. Really important that you learn about the history of Britain, and I say Britain, but Scotland specifically, about race, the construction of race, and also about the realities of empire on other people around the world. And allows you to practice perspective taking, to think about how somebody on the receiving end might talk about this in an exhibition or in an institution or within a community. Creating long-term partnerships with groups of Black people, people of colour, and particular individuals to make sure that you're really developing this sense of trust. Like I said, making sure to credit people's work and really insist that there is, if it isn't payment itself, you don't have the budget for that, that you're creating some sort of very, creating benefit sharing that is of use to that person, whether that's access to archives, whether that's access to networks or whatever it is, and making that very explicit. linking these opportunities to create long-term pathways, and also really exciting your present volunteers as well, to make sure that they're excited by this history. Some of them might be very conservative, some of them might be racist even, but there's a way of working with people, I think, gently to begin with, to start to change their mindset on how they think about their own history and make it exciting for them. Don't feel like it's like you're taking anything away from them. I think creating buddy systems can be really good, pairing people up with similar interests, but maybe coming from very different backgrounds, which may lead to long-term friendships. And also thinking about whose story is it, making sure that you are not gatekeeping information because you find it upsetting, making sure that people have that readily available to them, and especially if you're talking about stories of specific people's heritage, making sure that you are not hiding away that information. Let's go to the next slide, please. And that is just my contact details if you want to get hold of me. Lots of different ways that you can get hold of me there. So I've finished my presentation for now. I'm really excited to hear what Kat has to say next, and thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was so interesting, and I was trying to fully take notes and make sure that I was listening for your slide cues at the same time, thinking that's a good point, need to write that down. I think what you've managed to do there is actually give us a presentation which was kind of part history tour, which is so interesting, but then also part these are the things that you can do and this is how you could do it, and all the kind of top tips and information to share. So thank you very much for kind of providing both of those things, because we've absolutely learnt on two accounts there, which was fantastic. There's so much even in there. I think even just things like the walking tour element. I think we all know that it's so much easier to have difficult conversations when you're walking side by side with someone, opposed to looking at them straight across a table. You know, we all do that in our personal life. You go for a walk and have a chat. So that's really interesting, and I think there's lots there that our heritage trusts and community groups can take away and think about. I mean, I got so many ideas for projects there, because actually when you're looking at the history of your building and the history of your community, there's so many stories there, there's so much information, but also potentially if there aren't any maybe direct connections to slavery or the Caribbean or anything like that, there are stories that are still there to tell that you can do in your building, and you can invite people in to come and talk about that and run some workshops on that. That's just for everyone's benefit anyway. So that was really interesting. Thank you very much.